The next three sessions that we are going to, next three speakers that we have in this session are going to talk about application of principles of Krishna consciousness. And the first one is talking about Kaumaram to Yauvanam. Krsnendu Prabhu, you do have complete 25 minutes, including question answers. I take full responsibility for adjusting the schedule. So please go ahead and take your 25 minutes, but please leave about 4 or 5 minutes for question answers at the end. I invite you and request you to take over the symposium. Thank you.
Hey, Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu. Just a brief introduction about myself and why I've chosen this topic. The topic is Kaumaram to Yauvanam, which is basically talking about the transition from childhood to adulthood. And specifically, I'm looking at the transition here, particularly from the viewpoint of boys. Now, why is that? It's because I have a 14-year-old son, and it's a very real reality for me at the moment to see how I can guide him in the best way as he's making that transition from being a boy into being an adult. And you can physically see it. You can experience it by seeing his actions and his behavior. And it's an interesting challenge. So I'm going to share my screen now. And it's this, no, that's the screen. I want to share this window. Here we go. All right, so here's the cover picture showing the famous changing bodies. It's quite interesting in Bhagavad Gita that it talks about the Kaumaram, Yauvanam, Jara. It mentions from childhood to youth to old age. It doesn't talk anything about adulthood. In fact, this word Yauvanam is basically adulthood. Before that, there is a period called Kaishora, and that's the age from like 10 to 15. So we're basically preparing our children for adulthood. So let's just continue on here. The thesis that I have today is that Srila Prabhupada's vision is based on traditional models. So things that have been practiced in traditional cultures for many, many years, particularly in India, as naturally Prabhupada has that background. And I believe that the teachings that Srila Prabhupada has given us on this subject can be the solution for many of society's problems, and that it's quite different from the modern life that we're all living. Whether we're part of the Krishna consciousness movement trying to practice bhakti, or if we're just a regular person out in the world. So let's just have a look here at what are some of the issues that we face today. You know, as you can see in the picture, we've got these screens. It's something new. Even when Prabhupada was present, these screens were not really around. Television had just started. So therefore, the context changes, but the principles generally stay the same. So we have social media. This is one of the challenges that we're facing today. What are the challenges with social media? There's a lot of, just as in real life, there's bullying. There's now something called cyberbullying, where children are getting harassed through text messages and things like that, to the point where sometimes kids commit suicide. And why cyberbullying is worse than regular bullying in some ways is because the medium, the so-called social medium, is kind of anonymous. You will say things to people on social media that you will not say in real life. And therefore, the level of hurtfulness that can be expressed may be more, and it's very harmful for people too. The other aspect of it is that the cyberbullying, when someone receives that message, there may be nobody else present, nobody else even knows about it. And so this private aspect and not being able to talk to others about it is another thing that makes it quite scary. Another thing about social media is it can create false expectations and a competition. We look at the other people's posts. They're really enjoying in this material world. Look at the car that they've got. Look at their girlfriend. Look at the fun that they're having. What we don't think about is that people only post on social media the highlights of their life, all the good things that are happening. They don't post up, the time when they messed up, when they got angry, when they got depressed. generally these are not the things that get shared on social media. And therefore we can kind of get the idea that, everybody else is enjoying in the material world. I'm the only one who's not. And of course, this is not very helpful for our Krishna consciousness if we have that conception. So another point is, of course, illicit sex. It's a big topic. These days the social norms are quite different from how they were traditionally. It's a much freer society, and it's considered socially acceptable for boys and girls just to meet up and engage in illicit affairs and then just kind of move on. It's considered acceptable, although there are certainly consequences of this. Now, at school, they try to have some sexual education programs. However, what do they teach in these programs? All they basically teach is how to not get pregnant when you have sex and how to not get diseases when you have sex. If there's any talk about self-control or abstinence, the standards sexual education programs, they don't even talk about this. And if someone brings it up, they're looked down on. It's like, don't be ridiculous. Of course, these young people want to have sex, and why should we stop them? It's one of the joys of life. And they have this concept. And I did a Google search just today on a program called Sex Respect that was recommended to me. And all I could find was people criticizing, this is just so unrealistic. This abstinence is a very bad thing. So it's amazing, isn't it, how things change? Previously, chastity was valued, but now the values are completely opposite. We'll keep on moving. Now, just before I continue, I did want to actually say at the beginning that I want to give credit to Urmila Mataji for many of the things that I'm speaking about. I've listened to many of her podcasts on these subjects, and a big portion of what I'm speaking about I learned from her. And I've also, continued to develop my own ideas around these things. But I want to give credit where credit is due, that I've learned so much from Urmila Mataji. And if you are interested to learn more about these topics, I highly recommend her podcast called Bhakti Quest by Edith Best, I believe it's called. And in that podcast, if you search, you can find different topics. So what I did is I went through and I searched for all the topics about education, children, parenting, and these types of things. And that's the basis for a lot of what I'm speaking about here, along with a few of my own ideas that I've added on. All right, so the next thing that we look at is addictions. So the first addiction that we generally tend to think about is drugs. But there are other addictions as well. Video games. I'm sure you would have noticed, just like in this picture, these kids are on their devices. And many times what they're doing is they're playing games. And I have first-hand experience, or second-hand experience. I've observed how these games are so addictive, and they're designed in such a way that it makes you want to keep on the game and never stop. So if you've ever tried to tell a kid to get off a computer game, you'll know what I'm talking about. Oh, no, I just need to. The games create this mentality. So there's a lot of psychology behind these games. It produces dopamine, makes you feel good, makes you want to go to the next level. Some of these games are based around social experience as well, that while you're playing the game, you get on the phone, so to speak, you get on a call with others who are playing the game that are your friends, and it becomes part of your social experience as well. And these games can just suck up so much time in the day. Not only time, but these games today, often they give you the incentive to pay money so that you can get more power in the game. If you can't earn it, you have to pay to get another weapon or to get a better looking costume and things like that. So this is definitely one of the addictions which is very prominent today, which is certainly not helpful. And also the violence. This is one thing that Prabhupada referred to as well when he was talking about television, that there was so much violence. Well, these computer games are very often based on violence and not very helpful for our Krishna consciousness. So I mentioned drugs. There's not too much to say about that other than it's again become normalized, just like we were talking about the illicit sex. The drugs is very commonplace in the schools, the regular schools, at least in New Zealand. I'm sure it's the same in most places. And is that something we really want our kids to be exposed to? I don't think so. Now, porn. Porn is extremely addictive, and it's something which, again, has been normalized in the schools. I've spoken to quite a few kids at high school, and they have told me that, drugs and porn is just, accepted as normal. However, there are some people who are trying to fight against this in the sense of they realize the consequences of becoming absorbed in porn. Just to name a few. One is that this is a boys' problem, basically, is that boys get an unrealistic idea of what sex is about. So when they get into a relationship, they feel disappointed and not satisfied because of this false conception that they had. Because they've been aroused so much artificially, then they can't, find the proper connection when they are in a relationship like that. Another thing about it is just the physical effect, which is explained in our Shastras, but it's not really recognized in the mainstream, is that one drop of semen is equal to 64 drops of blood, according to Ayurveda. So it means that when someone is engaging in this type of illicit sexual activity and releasing semen, which is basically what porn is all about, the life force is leaving the body, and it makes a man weak. And when the man becomes weak, then it affects the relationships between the men and women as well. And so in so many ways, this is very, very harmful. And of course, when I was a young boy, they had something called porn, but it wasn't what we have today. It was some magazine that, your dirty old uncle had hiding in his cupboard. But nowadays, you just have to pick up a phone and it can just practically pop up on your screen. It's just so accessible. And then when you go to school and there's others doing it, I was just recently hearing a boy who goes to high school. He's a young man, I should say. He must be about 15. He said that the boys, they sit in the back of maths class with their phones and they look at porn during maths class. So, this is how addictive it is and how prevalent it is in mainstream schools today. So expanding on this is the indoctrination that comes. Now, actually, I think many of these things that we could talk about, just to be a little bit frank here, is that the mainstream schools are probably the best place to find out about all these things and to be exposed to them. And in particular, some of the indoctrination is, the materialism. The school has been created by people with an atheistic and materialistic worldview in general. And the whole goal is how to increase your economic situation so you can enjoy your senses better. A bit like what Hiranyakashipu was instructing his teachers to teach about. It's also creating an employee mindset. So this is what's described in Srimad Bhagavatam as overdependence on another's mercy. Srila Prabhupada was not into this. Prabhupada wanted devotees to be independent. He wanted them to, he didn't want them to become, as he would call, technologists, an expert in computers or an expert in machinery or something. And then you just have to go and beg from a business owner to become their dog. Like Prabhupada would say, you take the degree like a bone, you put it between your teeth like a dog, and you go begging for a master. So Prabhupada wasn't in favor of this because it weakens our freedom and it weakens our position. Prabhupada preferred that we had an independent livelihood as far as possible. He didn't want our members of society to become like Sudras, which means employee. He wanted to create leaders of society, Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. But this is one of the mentalities that is taught at school. The whole mentality is, okay, go to school, get good grades, go to university. With that degree, then you can go and get a good job and, get a mortgage and buy a house, and along with your, student loan that you have to pay off. And so you have so much debt towards the banks, and you're in such a compromised position because of this, rather than learning to maintain ourselves independently by, living off the land, or at least having a business like a contractor or something where you have more independence. Another type of indoctrination that you find especially here in New Zealand, mainstream schools, is the attack on family values. There's a very strong culture, at least here, basically attacking the idea that having a marriage between a man and a woman is the foundation of society, that this is the best social structure for raising children. Their whole conception is that whatever you want to do, that's fine. If you don't want to get married, it doesn't matter. If you just want to have connections with anybody, go ahead. Why the need for marriage? And so these are some of the values that are really emphasized, unfortunately, these days. Rather than trying to encourage people to fit into the traditional roles, they're telling people, oh, you should just reject the roles. And it's not, if you fit into the traditional roles, then there's something wrong with you. You should be, experimenting more and, breaking free from these family values that have been the foundation for our society for so many thousands of years. Anyway, I could go on that for a while, but I'll move on. So, as we can see, that there's some quite big problems in our society. A lot of them are very much propagated through our schools. All right, so let's have a look at some principles here that we can apply to help our kids navigate this this transition from childhood to adulthood. So I'll just quickly list them out here, and then I'll go into them each in more detail. So the kind of association that we give our children, engaging our children in a way that's very meaningful, nurturing values, in other words, counteracting the indoctrination that may be coming through the mainstream media or schools, developing a good lifestyle and habits, creating a positive association with Krishna consciousness so that the kids naturally want to do it, and creating a social structure that supports a positive life for Krishna consciousness development. Okay, so let's start with association. First point here that I'd like to emphasize is that as parents, it's really important that we develop empathy for our children, that we develop a very strong bond. It's said in the Shastra that the relationship with the Guru is a very strong bond of love and friendship. So as the first gurus of our children, we also need to develop this with our children, so that when any issues may come along in future, they have the trust to come to us and speak to us about them. Whereas if we're very judgmental and we don't listen to our kids, we rather tell them what to do all the time, it'll be much more difficult, to influence them in a positive way. As well as this, it's very helpful if as we're growing up, young people can have someone that they look up to as a mentor or guru. It doesn't have to be a big guru in the sense of, a Diksha guru. It could just be an adult who's, very established in their Krishna consciousness, who's a very good role model that they can build a relationship with and learn to, aspire to be like. This is also true in terms of vocation, not just in terms of a spiritual life, but, if there's a devotee who's got a profession and they can mentor us, it helps us to build our Krishna consciousness and connect it with our vocation as well. All right. So in terms of, we're up to association, okay. So in terms of this association with adults, I think this is particularly important when someone reaches to puberty, because typically this is what life is like in the modern world. From a very young age, you're put into childcare. So you're just associating mostly with kids your own age. And it remains like this until the age of 18 or even more. that you're in a class with people of the same age, and you don't really interact or associate much with those of other ages. So this gives a very unbalanced outlook on life, and it just kind of like amplifies the immaturity. So especially when we're talking about youth, that if the children or the youth that are becoming adults can associate more with adults, then they'll tend to become more like adults. They'll mature in a very nice way. Whereas if they're with kids the same age, they tend to, keep at each other's level. It's also helpful to have association of all different ages. This is a natural society that we help those younger than us, and we look up to those that are older than us. In this way, everybody grows and helps each other, rather than feeling a sense of competition. When kids are all the same age, there's often a competitive spirit. So anyway, this is where the idea of associating with adults is an important point to keep in mind, that we shouldn't just keep our kids only with those of the same age. All right, now let's talk about engagement. Engagement's a really important point here. So the key thing here I'd like to emphasize, and it relates back to the previous point, is that youth doesn't begin, adulthood doesn't begin at puberty. It's not like, oh, my kid's a teenager, now I need to start doing something. You have to be preparing your children while they're children, so that when it comes time for, puberty, that they've already been prepared. So let's just have a look at a few of the notes here. One of the things is giving responsibility from a very young age. When you're very young, you may have limited abilities, but whatever the ability is, we should engage the children. And we can see this in India. You've got these children who are 3 years old, and they're carrying a 6-month-old baby. So the older child is only 3, but they're still showing care for the other child. Or if you go outside the gate in Mayapur and you see them cooking the samosas, and it's like a 5-year-old child who's putting the samosas into the boiling hot oil. So they're learning real responsibilities, not just pretending. And like Prabhupada talked about, making a cake out of mud, just pretending. No, we're talking about doing real service. An example would be even a very young child, maybe like at the temple, could welcome the guests when they arrive. These are some services, or they could help to put the mats out on the floor for people when they're ready to sit down. So there's so many things that can be done. Also in deity worship, Prabhupada said that deity worship is not until you're 10 years or older. And of course in the temple, until you're Brahmin initiated, you can't do it. But we know that there's so many services that you can do before Brahmin initiation. And when a devotee joins, they do so many things like cleaning, helping to prepare. So children can also do these things, and it gets them excited about the prospect of, doing the deity worship, when they're a little older. So anyway, we can start with this from a very young age. And it's so important. And this is going back to the addictions. Why are computer games so addictive? It's because there's a challenge. You have a sense of achievement. You get into a flow state. You have the ability to master something. We can also find the same thing with Rubik's Cubes, or doing sports, things like that, that the same kind of the same concept is there. And in this way, when we can engage our kids in real life activities, then it helps to compensate, it gives them that feeling, and they don't have to compensate with these other things like computer games. And then as they're increasing their responsibility as they grow up, it means that when they enter their youth, they can have the skills to have an independent livelihood. All right, let's go to the next step. So the next step is about habits and lifestyles. So I'll go a bit quickly through this.
Krsnendu Prabhu, Hare Krishna. Sorry to interrupt your presentation. Prabhu, we've come to 25 minutes. There are a couple of questions.
I thought I had 1 more minute according to my timer.
Sure. Okay. Would you like to?
I'll jump to my summary page, and then we'll see if there's any question. All right. So the basic sadhana, and one thing I'd like to suggest is that having small gurukulas, residential-based education, can be helpful. Like the Chatuspatis we've been hearing about, but by providing a home environment where the actual, morning program can be practiced, can be helpful. Positive experiences, making it fun. And then also the other thing I'd like to emphasize is that having a young marriage is a very helpful thing, because we talked about this illicit sex, that the abstinence critics, they say, oh, no one can be abstinent. And in general, they're actually right. So if we have marriage from a very young age, then when the children turn into adults and they have these sexual strong hormones acting at the age of teenagers, they're already married, they have that facility to express that without causing a disturbance in society. So here's the summary of all my points here. Give responsibility from a young age so they can grow into it. Make sure that there's association with all ages, particularly adult association to grow into again. Avoid the mainstream media and schools. The indoctrination is not healthy. Let's see if we can have small schools where we can actually practice the Krishna consciousness lifestyle. And let's see if we can marry our kids young, because it'll make it a lot easier for them if they're married young than trying to artificially remain celibate in such a society that doesn't value it. So, I'll stop there. And if there's still any time, I can take a question or so.
Krsnendu Prabhu, revolutionary thoughts. First, a point of correction. Krsnendu Prabhu is based in New Zealand. And the thoughts that you're presenting here are revolutionary, because even within the circles of devotee communities, they're not often discussed. Young marriages, small residential schools, avoid mainstream media and schools. Wow, very thought-provoking. I encourage all the participants who feel very inspired to be in touch with Krsnendu Prabhu. Krsnendu Prabhu, could you please post your contact details, if it's okay, so that devotees can be in touch with you if they want to discuss this further?
Sure. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat, my contact.
Thank you. There was a question with respect to gaming and its addiction, but you sort of covered it.
Okay.
And I want to thank you a lot. I hope that we can discuss this also a little bit together offline.
Sure.
And see what can be done in this regard. So
yeah, hopefully it's planted the seed of just questioning the default method that we've been living and seeing if there are better alternatives.
Yes, I mean, the question here is that the seed was planted by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada himself. And the points that you're stating were loud and clear by Srila Prabhupada in the 60s and 70s. He established these small schools, rural living, and whatnot. But I do hope that when it's brought up in a forum like this, in a symposium like this, it's rekindled. And hopefully this time we are able to fan the spark further. And the only way it will happen is if more devotees come together to take this forward. That's the hope of the symposium, and that's the reason I requested you devotees here who feel inspired to be in touch with Krsnendu Prabhu and take this forward. Thank you, Prabhu. Very grateful for your time and for your participation. Very, very enthusiastic participation throughout the symposium, I noticed. I'm grateful.